Tyler, Megan, and Chris gathered at a street corner in their neighborhood, their laughter echoing as they joked about Mabel, an elderly woman living alone known for her wisdom. The trio, all white teenagers, decided it would be fun to visit her, unaware of the impact this decision would have on their lives. "Let's go see the old lady," Tyler suggested, a mischievous glint in his eye. "We can bring some snacks and a camera. It'll be like a safari." Megan giggled, twirling her hair. "Yeah, we can show everyone at school how brave we are, hanging out with her." Chris nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I bet she's got some crazy stories. We could make a viral video?" Their excitement grew as they planned their visit, treating Mabel like an exotic attraction rather than a human being. They felt fearless and superior, their privilege blinding them to the insensitivity of their actions. As they approached Mabel's house, a small, well-kept building with a neat garden, their bravado wavered slightly. Tyler knocked on the door, camera at the ready. Mabel opened the door, her warm smile contradicting the wary look in her eyes. She was shorter than they expected, her silver hair neatly tied back, and her dark skin wrinkled with age. "Well, hello there," she said, her voice strong despite her years. "What brings you young folks to my doorstep?" The teenagers exchanged glances, their planned bravado faltering in the face of Mabel's dignified presence. "We, brought you some snacks," Megan stammered, holding out a bag of store-bought cookies. Mabel's eyes twinkled, seeing through their facade. "How thoughtful. Why don't you come in and we can share them?" As they stepped inside, the teens felt the weight of their intentions. Mabel's home was filled with photos and mementos, each telling a story they hadn't considered. The atmosphere was light, but there was an undercurrent of tension as Mabel observed their superficial smiles and nervous glances. Little did they know, this visit would be the beginning of a journey that would challenge their perspectives and change their lives forever. As the teenagers settled into Mabel's living room, she offered them homemade cookies, their aroma filling the air. "These are much better than those store-bought ones," she said with a wink, setting the plate on the coffee table. Tyler, Megan, and Chris exchanged uncertain glances as they took the cookies. Mabel began to speak, her voice soft but clear. "You know, when I was your age, things were very different around here." The teens listened with barely concealed disdain, whispering and snickering among themselves. Mabel noticed their reactions, but continued undeterred. "We didn't have the freedoms you have now. Simple things like going to the movies or eating at a restaurant were a challenge for people who looked like me," Mabel explained, her eyes distant with memories. Tyler, feeling uncomfortable with the serious turn of the conversation, decided to lighten the mood. "Well, at least you didn't have to worry about bad movie sequels back then, right?" he joked, nudging Chris. Mabel's gaze sharpened, fixing on Tyler. Her voice took on a more serious tone. "Young man, every laugh has a price, and the true story is often painful. Are you prepared to hear it?" The room fell silent, the teenagers' smirks fading as they realized the weight of Mabel's words. Megan, intrigued despite herself, leaned forward. "What do you mean, Mrs. Mabel? What happened back then?" Mabel took a deep breath, her posture straightening as she prepared to share her story. "Let me tell you about growing up in a time of segregation. It wasn't just about separate water fountains or seats on the bus. It was about dignity, about being seen as human." As Mabel began her narrative, the teenagers found themselves drawn in, their initial intentions of making a spectacle forgotten. They listened, for the first time, with genuine interest as Mabel painted a vivid picture of a world they had only read about in history books. The atmosphere in the room shifted, tension giving way to a mix of curiosity and unease. The teens' phones lay forgotten as they absorbed Mabel's words, her experiences challenging their preconceptions and forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about the past and its echoes in the present. Mabel's voice trembled slightly as she recounted a pivotal moment from her childhood. "I was just 8 years old when I first truly understood what it meant to be different in the eyes of society," she began, her gaze distant. The teenagers leaned in, their earlier mockery forgotten, as they sensed the gravity of her words. "It was my first day at a newly integrated school. I walked in, proud in my new dress, only to be met with stares and whispers. A boy spat at my feet and called me a name I won't repeat. The teacher did nothing. Chris shifted uncomfortably, suddenly reminded of his own grandmother. He'd never asked about her past, never considered the hardships she might have faced. A knot of guilt formed in his stomach. Mabel continued, her voice gaining strength. I went home crying that day, but my mother told me to hold my head high. You're paving the way for others, she said. I didn't understand then, but I do now. Tyler, feeling defensive, tried to interject. But that was a long time ago. Things are different now, right? We don't. Mabel cut him off with a direct question, her eyes boring into his. Would you feel the same way if you were in my situation, young man? If you were spat on and called names for the color of your skin? The room fell silent. Tyler's mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. Megan looked at the floor, her cheeks flushing with shame. Chris stared at Mabel, seeing her, really seeing her for the first time. The silence stretched on, broken only by the ticking of an old clock on the mantel. In that moment, the gap between their worlds seemed both vast and surprisingly small. The teenagers grappled with emotions they hadn't expected, discomfort, guilt, and the first stirrings of understanding. Mabel watched them, her expression softening. She hadn't set out to shame them, but to open their eyes. As she saw the impact of her words reflected in their faces, she knew that this unexpected visit might just be the beginning of something important. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. Gone was the initial bravado and mockery of the teenagers. Instead, a somber mood settled over them as they processed Mabel's words. Megan, her voice barely above a whisper, broke the silence. How did you get through it all, Mrs. Mabel? It must have been so hard. Mabel's eyes softened at the genuine curiosity in Megan's voice. Resilience and hope, child. And the belief that things would change, even if I didn't see it in my lifetime. Tyler, still struggling with his emotions, asked, But don't you hate us? I mean, white people, for what happened? Mabel shook her head firmly. Hate only breeds more hate. I chose to focus on educating, on sharing my story so that future generations could learn and do better. Chris, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. I never asked my grandmother about her experiences. She's Asian, and I know she faced discrimination too. I feel terrible for never asking. Mabel reached out and patted Chris's hand. It's never too late to start those conversations, young man. Your grandmother's story is important too. Megan, fighting back tears, confessed, I once laughed at a racist joke some friends made. I didn't want to seem uncool. I feel so ashamed now. Acknowledging our mistakes is the first step towards change, Mabel replied gently. What matters is what you do from this moment on. As the conversation continued, the teenagers found themselves opening up, asking questions they'd never dared to ask before. They shared their own experiences with prejudice, however minor they seemed in comparison to Mabel's story. Chris, feeling a connection he hadn't expected, turned to Mabel. Your story is important, Mrs. Mabel. It should be shared with more people. Maybe we could help with that somehow? Mabel smiled, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. That, my dear, is how change begins. With understanding, empathy, and action. As the afternoon wore on, the initial purpose of their visit was forgotten. Instead, a transformative dialogue had begun, one that would challenge their perspectives and plant the seeds of change in their young minds. As Mabel finished recounting another poignant memory, tears began to roll down her weathered cheeks. The teenagers, once so cavalier, now sat in uncomfortable silence, moved by her pain and strength. Tyler, his earlier bravado completely gone, cleared his throat. Mrs. Mabel, I'm sorry. We came here thinking it was a joke, but this is real. Your life, your experiences, they matter. Megan nodded, wiping her own eyes. We've been so ignorant. How can we help change things? Make the neighborhood understand what you've been through? Chris, who had been quiet for a while, suddenly spoke up. What if we shared Mrs. Mabel's story with others? Maybe we could organize something at school or in the community center. Mabel smiled through her tears. That's very kind of you all. But remember, it's not just my story. It's the story of many who have faced discrimination and prejudice. The group fell into a thoughtful silence, each contemplating how they could make a difference. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically from when they first arrived. "What if," Tyler began hesitantly, "we created a mural? Something big and visible in the neighborhood. We could paint Mrs. Mabel's story, and maybe others too. Show the history that's often ignored." Megan's eyes lit up. "That's a great idea. We could get other kids involved too. Make it a community project." Chris nodded enthusiastically. "And we could interview other older residents, get their stories too. Make it a real celebration of diversity and resilience." Mabel looked at each of them, her eyes shining with a mix of tears and hope. "You young people continue to surprise me. A mural would be a wonderful way to share these stories." As they discussed the idea further, the teens felt a new sense of purpose and connection. What had started as a misguided prank had transformed into something meaningful. Tyler turned to Mabel, his voice sincere. "Mrs. Mabel, would you help us with this? Guide us to make sure we're telling the stories right?" Mabel reached out, patting Tyler's hand. "I would be honored to, young man. This is how change begins, with understanding, action, and hope." As the sun began to set outside, casting a warm glow through the windows, the group continued to plan, their excitement growing. They had entered Mabel's house as ignorant teenagers looking for amusement. They would leave as young activists, committed to making a difference in their community. The following weeks saw Tyler, Megan, and Chris spending most of their free time at Mabel's house, planning the community mural. The living room became their headquarters, with sketches, color swatches, and historical photos covering every surface. "I think we should use bold colors," Megan suggested, holding up a vibrant palette. "Something that catches the eye and makes people stop and look." Tyler nodded, adding, "And we need to include symbols of resistance and hope. Maybe a raised fist here and a dove there?" Chris, who had been researching local history, chimed in, "We should definitely include landmarks that were significant during the civil rights movement. There's an old church downtown that was a meeting point for activists." Mabel sat in her armchair, watching the teens with a mixture of pride and amusement. "Don't forget the everyday moments," she reminded them. "It wasn't all marches and speeches. Sometimes, resistance was as simple as holding your head high while walking down the street." The group took her words to heart, incorporating scenes of daily life alongside the more dramatic imagery. They debated color choices, composition, and which stories to highlight. As they worked, the teens found themselves opening up more. Tyler, usually the joker of the group, shared a serious moment. "You know, I never really thought about how my actions might hurt others. This project, it's changing how I see things." Megan nodded in agreement. "I've started calling out my friends when they make racist jokes. It's not easy, but I keep thinking about Mrs. Mabel's experiences." Chris, who had been quiet, added, "I finally talked to my grandmother about her life. She told me things I never knew. It's like I'm seeing my own family history in a new light." Mabel listened to their revelations with a gentle smile. "That's the power of storytelling and empathy. It changes us from the inside out." As the mural design took shape, so did a new understanding among the teens. They weren't just planning an art project. They were part of a larger movement towards understanding and reconciliation in their community. The day before they were set to start painting, Mabel surprised them with old photos of herself and her friends from her youth. "These might help you capture the spirit of the times," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The teens gathered around, examining the faces in the faded photographs. For the first time, they saw Mabel not just as an old woman, but as a young girl full of dreams and determination. It added a new depth to their project, a personal touch that would resonate with viewers. As they finalized their plans, there was a sense of anticipation and responsibility. What had started as a misguided prank had evolved into a profound journey of growth and understanding. The mural would be more than paint on a wall. It would be a testament to the power of listening, learning, and taking action. The day dawned bright as Tyler, Megan, and Chris gathered at the chosen wall, paint cans and brushes in hand. What started as their small group quickly grew as curious neighbors stopped by to see what was happening. "What's all this about?" asked Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly Hispanic woman from down the street. Tyler, newfound confidence in his voice, explained, "We're painting a mural to share Mrs. Mabel's story and the history of our community. Would you like to help?" To their surprise, Mrs. Rodriguez nodded eagerly. I have some stories to share too, she said, picking up a brush. As word spread, more people joined in. Mr. Kim from the local grocery store brought refreshments and stayed to paint. A group of kids from the nearby school arrived, excited to be part of something bigger than themselves. Megan found herself explaining the project to newcomers, her words flowing with passion she didn't know she possessed. This mural isn't just about the past. It's about understanding where we come from so we can build a better future together. Chris worked diligently on a section depicting the old church, listening as an elderly man shared his memories of attending civil rights meetings there. I never knew our town had such a rich history of activism, Chris mused, adding details to the painting based on the man's recollections. As the day progressed, the mural began to take shape. Vibrant colors brought to life scenes of struggle and triumph. Faces of local heroes, both known and unsung, emerged from the wall. Mabel arrived in the afternoon, escorted by a neighbor. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene. Dozens of people from all walks of life working together, inspired by her story. Mrs. Mabel, Tyler said, guiding her to a comfortable chair, we'd like you to share your story at the mural's unveiling. Would you be willing to do that? Mabel's eyes glistened with tears. I never thought I'd see the day when people would want to hear an old woman's tales. Yes, I'd be honored. As the sun began to set, the group stood back to admire their work. The mural was a tapestry of local history, pain, and progress intertwined in vivid color. Chris turned to his friends, paint splattered on his clothes. You know, when we first went to Mrs. Mabel's house, I never imagined it would lead to this. We've started something important here. Megan nodded, a determined look in her eyes. And it doesn't stop here. We need to keep fighting against prejudice in our schools, in our community. Tyler, usually the jokester, spoke seriously. This project changed us. Now it's our turn to help change others. As they cleaned up for the day, there was a sense of accomplishment and purpose among the group. The mural wasn't just a painting. It was a promise to continue the work of understanding and unity in their community. The day of the mural's inauguration arrived, bringing with it a mix of excitement and nervous energy. The neighborhood streets buzzed with activity as people from all corners of the community made their way to the site. Tyler, Megan, and Chris arrived early, making last-minute adjustments to the mural and setting up chairs for the audience. Their hands shook slightly as they worked, the weight of the moment sinking in. I can't believe how many people are here, Megan whispered, her eyes wide as she scanned the growing crowd. Chris nodded, swallowing hard. What if they don't like it? What if we got something wrong? Tyler, usually confident, looked pale. It's too late to worry about that now. We did our best, and that's what matters. As the crowd gathered, the diversity of the attendees was striking. Young and old, representing various ethnicities and backgrounds, they all came together, drawn by the promise of a shared story. Mabel arrived, assisted by her neighbor. The teens rushed to greet her, their nervousness momentarily forgotten in their concern for her comfort. Are you ready, Mrs. Mabel? Tyler asked, helping her to her seat near the podium. Mabel smiled, her eyes twinkling with determination. I've been ready for this moment for decades, child. As the ceremony began, a hush fell over the crowd. The mayor made a brief introduction, praising the initiative of the young people and the importance of community history. Then, it was Mabel's turn to speak. She rose slowly, aided by Megan, and made her way to the microphone. Her voice, when it came, was strong and clear, belying her age. I stand before you today not just as Mabel, but as a witness to history, she began. The crowd hung on her every word as she recounted her experiences, the struggles and the triumphs, the pain and the hope. As Mabel spoke, the teens watched the crowd's reactions. There were tears, nods of understanding, and moments of uncomfortable realization as people confronted hard truths about the past. Mabel concluded her speech with a powerful call to action. This mural is not just a reminder of the past, but a beacon for the future. It challenges us to do better, to be better, to create a community where everyone is valued and respected. The applause was thunderous. People rose to their feet, moved by Mabel's words and the visual impact of the mural. As the clapping died down, a voice cut through the crowd. "This is all lies. You're trying to make us feel guilty for things we didn't do." The celebratory mood shattered as heads turned to locate the source of the outburst. A middle-aged man stood near the back, his face red with anger. Tension crackled through the air as the crowd murmured, unsure how to respond. The teens exchanged worried glances, their moment of triumph suddenly threatened by the harsh reality of lingering prejudice. The disruptive voice belonged to Mr. Lawson, a longtime resident known for his conservative views. He pushed his way through the crowd, his face contorted with anger. "This mural is nothing but propaganda. You're trying to rewrite history." The atmosphere quickly shifted from celebratory to tense. Tyler, Megan, and Chris instinctively moved closer to Mabel, forming a protective circle around her. "Sir, please," the mayor attempted to intervene. "This is a community event. Let's discuss this calmly." But Mr. Lawson wasn't interested in calm discussion. "You're indoctrinating our kids with this garbage. We don't need to keep dredging up the past." Several other adults in the crowd, emboldened by Mr. Lawson's outburst, began voicing their own objections. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. Tyler, feeling a surge of courage, stepped forward. His voice shook slightly, but he spoke clearly. "Mr. Lawson, this isn't about making anyone feel guilty. It's about understanding our history so we can do better." Megan joined in, her voice stronger than she felt. "We interviewed people who lived through these times. These are real experiences, not propaganda." Chris added, "The mural shows both the struggles and the progress we've made. It's a story of hope, not blame." But their words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Mr. Lawson and his supporters grew louder, drowning out the teens' attempts at reason. Mabel, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mix of sadness and determination, slowly rose to her feet. She placed a hand on Tyler's shoulder, her touch conveying strength and reassurance. "Young man," she addressed Mr. Lawson directly, her voice cutting through the noise. "I lived this history. Every word, every image on this wall is a piece of my life and the lives of many others in this community." The crowd fell silent, all eyes on Mabel. Even Mr. Lawson seemed taken aback by her direct address. "This mural isn't about blame or guilt," Mabel continued. "It's about acknowledging the past so we can build a better future. It's about ensuring that the struggles and sacrifices of those who came before us are not forgotten." Her words hung in the air, challenging the dissenters to respond. The tension was palpable, with both sides seemingly at an impasse. In that moment, the true test of the mural's impact and the community's ability to confront its past and present hung in the balance. The teens exchanged worried glances, realizing that their project had stirred up deep-seated issues that wouldn't be easily resolved. As the tension reached its peak, an unexpected voice cut through the crowd. "Dad, stop it." The sharp command came from a young woman pushing her way to the front. It was Sarah, Mr. Lawson's daughter and Tyler's mother. The crowd parted, all eyes now on Sarah as she stood between her father and the mural. Her presence created a sudden, stunned silence. "Mom." Tyler's voice was barely a whisper, confusion evident on his face. Sarah turned to face the crowd, her expression a mix of determination and pain. "I've never spoken about this publicly, but it's time." She took a deep breath before continuing. "When I was younger, I faced discrimination because of my skin color. Yes, I'm Mr. Lawson's daughter, but I'm also black." The revelation sent shockwaves through the gathering. Mr. Lawson's face paled, his anger replaced by visible discomfort. Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. "I kept silent about my experiences, thinking it would make things easier. But seeing this mural, hearing Mrs. Mabel's words, I realized that silence only perpetuates ignorance." She turned to her son, Tyler, who stood frozen in shock. "Tyler, honey, I'm sorry I never told you about this part of our family history. I thought I was protecting you, but I was wrong." Tyler stumbled forward, embracing his mother tightly. The crowd watched in silence as this family drama unfolded, the personal suddenly becoming deeply political. Mabel stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Thank you for your bravery, child. Your story is exactly why this mural is important." Mr. Lawson, his earlier bravado deflated, looked lost. Sarah, I didn't know. Why didn't you tell me? Sarah's reply was soft but firm. Because, Dad, you never seemed ready to listen. But now, maybe you are. The atmosphere in the crowd shifted. Those who had been vocally against the mural now looked uncomfortable, confronted with a real, personal story of struggle within their community. Megan and Chris moved to stand beside Tyler and his mother, forming a united front. Chris spoke up, his voice clear. This is what the mural is about. Not just history and books, but the lived experiences of people in our community. Megan added, it's about opening our eyes to stories we might have overlooked or ignored. As the tension dissipated, replaced by a somber reflection, people began to approach the mural again. This time, they looked at it with new eyes, seeing not just paint and images, but real stories of real people, some of whom were standing right beside them. The mayor, seizing the moment, stepped forward. This is a powerful reminder of why projects like this are so important. They challenge us to confront uncomfortable truths and grow as a community. As the event wound down, small groups formed, engaging in quiet, intense discussions. The mural had become more than just a painting. It was now a catalyst for change, sparking difficult but necessary conversations throughout the community. Tyler, still processing the revelation about his family history, turned to Mabel. Thank you, Mrs. Mabel. Without you, none of this would have happened. Mabel smiled, her eyes twinkling with a mix of tears and hope. No, child. Thank you all for being brave enough to listen and act. This is just the beginning. As the sun set, casting a warm glow on the mural, the community stood united. Not in perfect harmony, but in a newfound willingness to listen, learn, and grow together.